No.
Thank Lisa Jackson for not filing a workman's comp claim. Kathy for continuing to be a princess but not wearing out. Or an assault, one or the other. You did. You may have protected it. You sat like so let's do welcome, and then introduction. Sounds about that. Why don't we change this? Let's start around the corner rather than take this to death.
Anika, VMA, Anika Bond.
Hello, I'm Mary Short, and this is my daughter, Katie. I represent families with severe and profound intellectual disabilities across the state. I have about 200 families on an email list.
Hi, Barbara Agnello, the Clinical Director at Cardinal Innovations.
Mabel McLaughlin, Division of Mental Health, Developmental Disabilities, and Substance Abuse Services.
Kimberly Mosman, I'm the Regulatory Director at Cardinal Innovations.
Hi, Justin Gross, Coastal Care Utilization Management.
Rachel Noel, Developmental Disabilities.
That's good.
I'm Latifah Cuthbert, I'm the Academic Information Supervisor for Private School.
Lisa Jackson, DMA.
Maya Williams, I'm with Mabel. Monica Hamlin, DNA.
I'm Cindy Ellers, the Chief of Clinical Operations for East Carolina Behavioral Health.
Sarah Potter, Observer.
Kenneth Marcel, Division of Medical Assistance.
Deb Goda, DNA.
Next, Matthew Potter, Consumer Advocate, Recipient of Services, and Assistant Project Director to the North Carolina Advocacy Ambassador Commission.
Mike Mayer.
That's it?
Too many hats.
I'm
not sure what to
Marlon
Stakeholder,
Wells.
and Stakeholder.
Marlon Wells with the Exceptional Children's Assistance Center.
John Nash, the ARC of North Carolina.
Beverly Moore with Sound North Carolina. Here.
Mary Hooper, Tennessee Council of Community Programs.
Melissa Barrett, North Carolina Association of Rehab.
I'm Ed Walsh with the North Carolina Providers Association.
Bruce O'Leary, Eric.
Ashley Young, Carrier of the Autism Society of North Carolina.
And Chris Egan with the North Carolina Council on Developmental Disabilities.
Dave Richard with DHHS.
Kathy Nichols, DMA. And you have 2-1.
Somebody else just walked in.
Oh, okay. So we just wanted to take a second for you to review the minutes from our last meeting. See if we want to approve them or amend them in some kind of way. We are working on the website and updating it with all the stakeholder meetings and with all of your information, so in case anyone else contact you to give you some input, don't be surprised, but also we'll be posting the minutes as well as in PowerPoint, so it's sent out for various reasons. formal Robert Rule of Orders, but are you okay to approve them and take the draft off and send it on?
Yeah, there's just a type on the last page, I think. The first bullet under resident support stakeholder responses,
Uh-huh.
turnover rater.
Yeah, okay, got it. Okay, anything else? If you catch something later, you can always email us or contact us. Anika, are you from doing the minutes? I think she's doing a fabulous job because it's hard to keep up with a lot of dialogue sometimes, so I want to give her full credit for doing that. Might not recognize her without the orange weave. Okay, so this may be a shorter meeting, but we want to keep going because we have the holidays coming up, and we also have the deadline on the waiver, so we wanted to just make sure we got, if we had something, make sure we got you something. So today, Kenneth, Cindy, Barbara, and Justin and these are some of our various, they introduced themselves, so they went around. Kenneth Bossell is with CMA, and Cindy Ellers is with ECBH, and Barbara Agnello, who's over there on that side, is with Cardinal, and Justin Rose is with Coastal Care, so you have a lot of your COs represented today for the discussion that they're gonna have regarding utilization management. So I don't know who your main speaker is gonna be, but.
Well, just, so I'm gonna turn it over to Barb, Cindy, and Justin. We've been working together and they're very excited and passionate about this topic. So they're gonna run through the presentation.
Okay. So I'm the first one up, and I'll stand up here if that's okay with you. I'm not sure who's doing the clicking. Deb's going to do that for us, so thank you, Deb. So we'd like to start out the meeting a little differently maybe than normally. The stakeholders certainly, and I respect the way that you guys run the meeting, so we're going to ask for stakeholder input, but we're also going to be open to hearing what folks around the room have to say, just for the purposes of our initial brainstorming, because you can never have too much input on a process like this. So what we're really here to talk about today is the plan approval process. Some people might call that but it is the way that people get authorized the services and how the process works around that particular piece of the resource allocation model. We wanted to start out by asking you a few questions. I'd just like to do kind of a round robin to hear what people have to say. They'd like to see us in this policy that needs to change. So I'm sure lots of folks can think of things they really hate about the system today. We're really kind of trying to narrow that down into the framework. So, or the way that plans get approved or not for authorizations to go forward for people to get services. So, what are some things you really don't like that you'd like to see us change, or some of the challenges that the current process in the system presents? Justin's going to write those down for us in the back, so we can make sure we get them all recorded. So, anybody like to start? Okay.
I'll jump in. Actually, I got these questions as I was on my conference call with my group. So, one of the things that comes up, and I think we've talked about in this group, is that with individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities, it's really not a medical model format. And I think a lot of times UM has really guided by the medical model. And I think that that needs to change in working with people in this plan approval process.
So to move away from a medical model approach. Okay? Great.
I have a thought that kind of piggybacks off of that. Add this. That I understand the need for assessments in figuring out, what a person needs or what kind of service allocations we're talking about, especially if we're moving more towards individualized budgets, then it's going to be even more important. Having said that, I don't know what the best solution is, but while I haven't done the SIS yet, I was part of sort of a trial run while they were training people how to do it. And I think to an extent this is kind of unavoidable, but it's also, for a person with a disability, I think sometimes it can be very daunting and very scary, and even for family members or parents or whoever else, because they're afraid that this assessment is going to determine something major about the person's life. And I don't know what the best way to kind of change that environment is, but I really think that that's one of the biggest problems about this system right now, is that people are terrified when they actually go into these assessments because they're afraid of what they're going to hear.
Because in a managed care model, assessments might equal reductions.
Yes.
Right? So it's how assessments are applied, something that, and how they're used really to inform what people get, right? Does that capture what you were saying? Okay. All right. Anybody else? Something you think needs to change? Okay, so we can let them nominate. Okay, you got okay. All right, go ahead.
The other thing that was prevalent in our discussion was that for reviewers to really know what the services are that are out there, to have a sense about what's in their community, what are the services that exist that are realistic to be, and how they actually run. To actually maybe even have a chance for education of the individuals to really go out and see the services and see what they are and see the individuals that are receiving the services.
So can I ask you, would you consider adding care coordination to that?
Yes.
Okay,
Sure.
so and care coordination really having a good understanding of the entire service array.
Yes.
How it's delivered in their local community.
Right.
Doing all that.
And each local community, I think, is very important.
Okay.
We run across that a lot where they suggest services that aren't appropriate or wouldn't work for that consumer, or they suggest community guide, which doesn't do that piece.
Okay. All right, yes ma'am.
I just want to ask a point of clarification. Are you talking about formal as well as informal supports and services? Or are you talking about formal services, informal supports? Because I think both of them.
I would agree on both. I think they were really gearing more towards even the formal, but I have to agree that both formal and informal.
So Justin, if you could add to that, include informal supports that they're recommending as well. Okay? Great. Good clarification. Yeah, Chris.
I think I've just piggyback on some of what's already been said. I know as we move into this process, there's a potential perception that the score on one particular assessment may be the end all or the be all, and I think really making sure there's some understanding and good communication of how this really works, so it's less mystery behind it.
Right, so getting the mystery out of the system. So people don't have to feel like they have to game it or work around it to get to what they need, right? You have to buy the right assessment to get the right amount of hours. Mike?
I think that one of the things that a lot of people have talked about is that it's assessment and there's the clinical part of this. So we spend a lot of time talking about what's important for somebody. But if it's a person-centered system, then there should be what's important to the person. It should have equal value in determining at least how the services are delivered or the supports are coordinated and those kinds of things. And I think all too often, important too gets left at some other table and never hits this process the way it was intended to.
So the person-centered value of 2 is equal to 4.
Yes.
So 2 is equal to 4 in that whole process.
Might not be good math, but it makes sense.
Right. Absolutely. Okay? Other input? Okay?
Well, and this goes back to the part about the medical model. And that individuals with intellectual developmental disabilities are not going to necessarily get better. They're not going to improve on their IQ score. They're getting supports and supports waiver. And the idea of we may do some step down on tasks so somebody learns, but it's usually in a long line of things that need to be accomplished. And so this sense that sometimes we're seeing now is, well, services are being cut because they're making improvements, but there's still so much further in so many other places that need to go. And I think going back to that idea and that mindset with this population.
And I would say not entirely with this population. I've got to argue that a little bit because we've got to talk about the clinical needs for services and how they can be used. And so if you start to look at I want to talk a minute about how it's implemented right now. A lot of times with most NCOs, honestly, our folks are getting just the long-range outcomes. There is no coordination with the short-range goal, which is administratively burdensome. If we did have to do that, I get it. But I think what it does do is it does tie nicely on the UN side in point 2 and in point 4 with a clinical eye, which is what ECBH does. But right now, you did ask for a short-range goal. So it's kind of a technical comment that I just made, but I think that does help because they're well written and it's a good guide. The ones that I have seen, honestly, from the other ones, it's receive respite, receive.
They're so broad.
They're so broad. You know, that really does. And if we are really just talking about sport, cool, great, fine. But if we're really talking about here's how we're going to improve a skill and here are the steps we're going to do in the task analysis, that needs to get much more specific and really needs to be a coordinated plan.
So where in the plan do the short-range goals go? So maybe let me just have a little facilitated conversation. They're in the overall plan. But when you submit them in the plan to UN, that makes them have to be revised as they need to change. When you submit just long-term goals, then you don't have to constantly do the revisions back and forth for approval for UN. And that's ECBH did recently choose not to do that anymore because it was costing people a lot of time in getting timely services because of the constant need to revise the plans in this really formal process, which did cut down on how timely you could be in that response time to people's needs, while we still hold providers accountable to having really good, comprehensive, short-term goals in the task analysis. It's just not a part of the plan that gets approved for an authorization of hours.
Yeah, and see, I just went to a short-term goal training, and she basically told us to make all our goals independent. That way that we wouldn't have to revise the plan throughout the year. We could just revise the hows and change the hows. But in essence, that doesn't.
It depends on how the LMCO does it.
Yeah, right. So it's inconsistent.
Yeah, it is inconsistent. So being consistent about what's expected going forward in the submission. What's being submitted? Is it the whole thing? Is it part of it? What is it?
And it's the time limit on the authorizations. We talked about that a couple of meetings ago, but we don't have to do that so often if we're doing the annual authorization on the service versus 90 days or 30 days.
Yeah. Okay. Anything else about the current process, Mike?
Real quickly, you see a lot of people who have had a history of being in crisis or having major problems. We get them stabilized, and then we wind up with service reductions, and they go back into crisis. And it seems to me like you shouldn't have to fail once in order to be able to maintain what is stabilizing and preventing a crisis.
The only other thing that I'm going to add is with regards to goals. And I've mentioned this in past meetings. I understand the need for goals to an extent, but the more mired down in the idea of goals we get, the more I become wary, because I've seen people's lives be turned into nothing more than a series of written goals on a piece of paper that totally ignore so many other aspects of a person's life. So, I'm not saying ditch goals altogether, because they have a very real and practical application, especially for certain people with profound needs that may be trying to learn a certain skill or whatnot. But using that as a major benchmark as to whether a plan is successful or not is not necessarily a one-size-fits-all proposition. So I would just be there.
So Justin wrote, individuals are not goals. Did I get it?
Yep.
All right. Spot on. Okay, great.
And more goals will equal more service.
More goals shouldn't equal more services.
Right, exactly.
Right. So you don't have to have 20 just to be able to get 20 hours, right?
No.
A managed care medical model might drive things in that direction. Right? We're all really good at that now for the last decade. Except Cardinal, because they haven't had to play the game. Okay. Any other feedback on this question? So the next question was, so how do we design a system with a plan approval process that lets us be accountable to the person. And what we mean by that in kind of loose terms is that we have a system here for them, right? Because if it's everything anybody wants all the time, that's not an accountable system. So we have to develop an accountable system that makes it available to the person. You know, that's really kind of what the concept was around that. While it's both clinically sound, financially responsible, but still lets the person achieve their dreams in life and doesn't make them become a goal. So, yeah.
Let's start with that by asking the question in reverse. Systems develop to deliver what they're designed to do. You know, while all those things are important, the problem we run into in a lot of places is we take all the important things and try to do all of them, and things get lost in the mix. And so looking at the list of accountability to the individual, clinically responsible, and financially responsible, are we talking about it in that specific order?
No.
Because if not, you change any one of those, if you put 1, 2, 3 next, then the first is responsibility to the individual, accountable to the individual. If you move that anywhere in the process to number 1, number 2, or number 3, you get a different outcome. And that's why maybe before we go too much further, to be able to come up with something that's standard that everybody can agree to, you got to put numbers next to those. What is the first and foremost priority? Is it accountability to the individual? And if that's the case, is number 2 clinically accountable and responsible, and is number 3 financially accountable?
Or is it money first?
Or is it money first? Or is financial come before clinical? Because again, you change that order and you get a very different outcome.
Absolutely. So having some guidance around what are the principles we're after here would really helpful.
Yeah, and if that's the case, then if you build around each one of those, guarantees and ensures that first and foremost, we are accountable to the individual, that before we look at anything else, before we look at the clinical issues, before we look at the financial issues, we're looking at the individual. And once we've met those criteria, then we can step down and say, okay, we've done that, next. But don't subordinate one to the other, especially when everybody's looking at that list in a different fashion.
Sure. Our finance people are going to look at it, that it's financially responsible, it's within their data book, and it's the budget, on point with the budget. And no matter how you write that, the financial people are going to look at it through that lens set, right? That's just the way it functions. So clinical people tend to function with the clinical lens, and individuals that receive services in their families with the what about me lens, right? Because it is that personal for people that get services. Okay. Any other input on this question? You know, that's great. That's great. Yeah.
Just a quick suggestion, and I totally hear what John is saying, and I agree. But I think that this suggestion, regardless of what priority you put in, I think that it's a very real, concrete step that might help. Being more upfront with people about what their, budget uses are and that kind of thing, especially going to the individual budget, system, which is something that I agree is a good idea, but, you just think about it from the perspective of, let's just, for the sake of the discussion, for an analogy, if you think about a phone company and, data usage or whatever else kind of, you can link that up anytime you want to. And I think regardless of what their priorities are, and this goes beyond the plan approval process and into utilization as well, so it's kind of a 2-for-1 type deal. But if we create an environment where people are routinely aware of what their budget usage is, what different services cost, then not only are the consumers of services more aware, the providers are more aware, but also everyone is becoming more educated about it. I think that it's a more collaborative effort in the future as opposed to just feeling like they're completely in different areas.
So making sure we get people information, clarity on their budget, where they are, what their account balance is, if you will, kind of thing. Okay, good. Anything else on this one? Anybody? Hey, Bob?
Hey Cindy, I'm sorry I had a conflict and had to miss the beginning, so you may have already covered this. You know, one of the challenges, whether you address the person or clinical or financial, has to do with how our system construct has been and the dependency on Medicaid. And, you know, medical, you know, I remember a leader of DMA one time said, we need more, when we stated we need more habilitation, and it should be a habilitated model, not a medical model. I was reminded that Medicaid is a medical model. Be careful what you ask for. Now, that was years ago. That was before our 1915C waiver, and you would hope the flexibility to manage a system differently with different priorities, as been discussed, or different outcomes that we're looking for that are stable, predictable, cost control, meet the person's needs, all that together. So I guess the question is, to me, in the current 1915C waiver and in these next iteration of our innovations waiver, are we going to have the flexibility to provide more of a support model that is leads to persons' outcomes that they need versus, I mean, at the same time, we have to have cost control. We want to have these services. They need to be affordable services. But if you understand my question, are we going to have more latitude to proclaim that for people with intellectual developmental disabilities and other community support needs, are we going to have the ability to fund those services with a habilitative focus, only the medical focus when they need the medical focus as part of their overall habilitation?
So can I just jump in? Because I didn't hear you say that, but I appreciate the reminder that we are a medical program.
Did he sound like a DMA person? I don't
Really,
know.
maybe
He
we're about
did
to
for a second. I'm like, who are you?
But I mean, the short answer is yes, that's the goal. I mean, we'll have to submit it and it'll have to be approved. But absolutely, I think that's the goal of overall, not just in this particular topic. Overall, we're trying to achieve.
Right. And so what Justin's written up there is flexibility, habilitative versus a medical model. Medical when you need it though, and affordable, right? And so I think what you're going to see, the work the MCOs have done along with our state partners in this particular work group around care management, as Barb gets up to talk when I'm done, hopefully you're going to hear some of that about how we're recommending to you as the stakeholders that might get accomplished. So,
and I guess I would add, and in the future, integrated. In the future, integrated. Because unless I'm missing something, that is a requirement of where we're being directed by the General Assembly of North Carolina.
Okay, John, do you have something there?
We hear an awful lot about the medical model. It just occurred to me that we call it a medical model because the medical approach is a measurement of progress. That at some point, the services would diminish to the point of non-existence because we progress through, and so it's a matter of measurement. So really what we're talking about is if we stay within the medical model and are consistent with the concerns for people with IDD who there is not a curative approach, then we have to change the definition of what we're measuring and change the measurement approach as opposed to changing the services approach.
And CMS, you know, again, whatever we do is going to have to be approved, but I think that the difference between, because even when they come back with their request for additional information and some of the other things that happen as you try to get a waiver approved, they're very aware that habilitation is not rehabilitation. So I think that's sellable.
Yeah, but it in the community does cost a lot less than institutional care, which is the whole purpose of having all the community-based waivers, is to reduce the higher cost levels of care.
And again, you may have talked about it, but is treatment support and support treatment? And are we paying for support? Even though it's not an individual, very specific goal that would be considered treatment, is more general that still gets to the outcome that the person needs in their life. Is that support a medically reimbursable activity?
So making sure it's medically reimbursable. Did I get it? Medically reimbursable. Making sure that it's medically reimbursable. is delivered. Okay, so the final question, just in the essence of time, don't want to take up all afternoon. We are here for 4, right? If you could change anything right now that you really don't like about the system, well, we kind of talked about it, so we'll make sure I get it. What is it that you hate, that you just hate, that you really like to see changed in this policy development? Okay, good one. Winner. Winner, chicken dinner.
I brought this up once before in a previous meeting, and I'm not sure how this really, in terms of the approval process, figures in, but maybe the reapproval process. But there's a lot of time and energy and money being spent on reapproval, retesting. And it seems that it's burdensome.
So is this the getting another psychological evaluation every 3 or 5 years, those sort of things?
Or reconfirming autism diagnosis.
Justifying.
Or an IQ score?
Yeah.
That kind of thing. Okay.
On that note, as behavioral health, meaning reform for mental illness and substance use, we didn't have so much reform initially on IDD. But with that, as that process moved forward, certainly the authorization and reauthorization process changes for people with IDD. It became a more short-term, because y'all did it. You changed the authorization for people that need lifelong supports. And yes, we need to touch base and be sure that they have not moved to a point of ineligibility, but someone that's within the profound range of intellectual disability, that is not going to change for them their entire life. They will need supports, either by natural supports through families or paid supports, their entire life. And yet we act as though the rehab model is implied on top of that, and it's time that we really face some of these realities, and within the context of whatever Medicaid will pay for and allow, the authorization and reauthorization period should be as long for those periods as possible. And you can take a vote for people in this room on that point, and I'd be curious, that's up to you to decide as MCO LMEs and the state, but I believe that we would say that we have adopted too much of a rehab model that has been imposed on the IDD system.
So you'd like to see longer-term authorizations, maybe an annual when possible? That
yes.
Longer term, that's the short term. Let me get her and then I'll get you. So,
I also think that not just longer, because I think it needs to be situational. If there is a significant change in, there needs to be a review, I think it's appropriate. To make an assumption that it's an annual decision is as inappropriate as if it's 6 months or 3 months or whatever. I really do think it needs to be situationally fluid.
So the system needs to be flexible enough to change as the needs of the person change. They may get an annual authorization, but we could come in and expand it or change the array.
If you have a stable situation, why would you require it?
But for somebody that's in crisis and changing, maybe it's necessary.
And that goes into now, some of them that I've seen, it's 3 hours on Monday and 2 hours on Tuesday. Some that I've seen, so I think it gets the whole flexibility and fluidity of all of the services, not just kind of the authorization for a service as a whole, but how is it actually going on?
And then it begs the question also is what's the value of that once you've done it? We have a difficult time in the state finding folks who are really well qualified to address some of the needs of our individuals in that environment. And once even that evaluation or that assessment's done, how's it utilized? It's not enough to have an evaluation.
Right. So did you get what the assessment, the plan, everything said you needed? Did that actually happen? Did you get what you paid for? Because when people are managing their own budget, it's really like managing your own bank account. And did you get what you said you wanted, that you needed, that you paid for with these hours you've been allocated by the state? And that is a really important consumer thing for all of us as consumers, any kind of consumer we are. We want to make sure that cell phone data is there when we're buying it, right? And if it's not, we're not going to be a happy consumer. Right? So, go ahead.
First of all, I 100% agree that the assessment thing should, if it's, or plans changing, that should be, tailored to what the person's life is like. I 100% agree with that. For people that are in changing circumstances, they shouldn't have to wait or fear that they're not going to be able to get what they need in terms of changing what a plan is like. Having said that, even
so wait a minute, I want to make sure I capture something. We don't want people to have fear about their needs changing and not being able to get their needs met because they got an individual budget.
Exactly.
Okay. I don't want to lose that one. That's really important.
On the other end of the spectrum, though, I mean, we're talking about annual, reviews. If that's like some, fantastic thing I realize that there's some degree of review that needs to happen. I get that, but I receive services and I talk with my caseworker on a monthly basis, and he comes to see me in person every 3 months or so, and then once a year I have to have a meeting with him and a nurse, and there's got to be the whole rigmarole and all that, and it's every year it's the same thing, where they ask me the same questions, like, do you still need assistance with this? They're like, do you still need complete and total assistance with transferring here? Yep. Do you still need assistance with?
You just want to say duh,
yeah,
right?
It's like okay. Obviously, there are people whose circumstances change a lot, and there's going to come a time where my circumstances are going to change. Because there's going to come a time where my natural supports are going to change, and quite possibly not either. But at the same time,
that must be your mother.
It's pretty brutal on the
Gosh, Mom.
Well, interesting ride home.
He's writing me out already.
They say it more often than I do, I assure you. But
at least you're on the same page and you're ready.
It's just again, we're talking about it being tailored to the person. There comes a point where it's just silly. Like, I can't think of any other word to describe it. And not only is it kind of annoying for the people that have to do it, but it's a waste of time and a waste of money, frankly. So, I mean, it's just, we have to use more common sense, I guess, is what my point really boils down to, is making it as common sense as possible.
As common sense as possible.
Which I realize is asking.
Yes, it is, in some ways. Okay, so, I want to touch that.
Well, I was going to just
Yes,
throw out
go ahead.
just efficient, like he's talking about efficiencies in the process, efficiencies in the paperwork. I mean, there's so much that has to be, done. It's so time consuming, and what is the value in it all? I mean, our target pop's really changing every year. I mean, all those things that are, all the things that we have to do. I mean, where are the efficiencies that can happen, and really looking at it within that.
Right now, it's super disjointed. I mean, I think we've said that when we really talk about implementation, it goes back to the standardization.
Can you speak up, please?
It's super disjointed, right now, upon the implementation, that you'll get care coordinators submitting long-range outcomes without coordination with the family even around what the short range will look, what I mean? It's just there's not a consolidated effort around the plan, I would say probably 75% of the time.
So plan development you're talking about, not plan approval.
Correct, I'm sorry.
So, yeah, that's okay. So, there are other groups represented in the room that are working on the plan development piece and care coordination and all that sort of jazz, so hopefully they're taking notes and take that back to their crowd. All right, so I'm going to get to the outside folks, Mary. Hang on. So everybody here at the table, it's a stakeholder, had what you got to say. I want to make sure we do at least acknowledge, if that's okay, the folks on the outside of the room, right, include the state people. If you got something you want to add. So I'll leave you out. So anybody on the outside that wants to chime in on any one of these questions, we can get your stuff. So Mary?
Yeah. The idea that, the basic idea is a 1915C waiver is for long-term services and supports. And prior to the LME-MCO system, I never got the impression that anyone thought that at the end of a 12-month period of time that Katie didn't exist. And so we had to pretend we were submitting this brand new plan for this brand new person as if she'd never walked the face of the earth before. But now that we're in LME-MCO, that's exactly what happened. So why utilization review and the plan approval process is incapable of understanding the concept of long-term services and supports is beyond my understanding. It is, again, to use the Secretary's word, counterintuitive. So that's really where plan approval needs to get its act together. And all these pages and pages and pages and pages of documentation, year after year after year, it's just exhausting. And it's unnecessary. And it's beyond frustrating. And it ties into, have you read your website lately? And have you read the information that you posted about appeals? And at the end of the document where it talks about the appeals process, it says, and then it starts over next year.
Right.
Shoot me.
Make sure, Mary, before you go on, I get a couple of things. So you want to make sure that the plan approval process understands long-term supports. And you want to make sure that the plan approval process includes appeal rights. Well, you didn't say that directly. I just want to make sure that's still important because you didn't mention it. But you did.
Right. And the other thing is the timing of all of this. There have been a number of times over the years where the documents weren't done correctly, either by the targeted case manager or the care coordinator, and it gets bounced back from utilization or value options. And because of that timeline that things have to get done, suddenly we were faced with the idea that, November 1st, there's not a plan that's been approved. So why is that Katie's fault? So again, the idea that there's no maintenance of service or there's no continuation of benefits, she's never walked the face of the planet before, and it's not her fault, and she's not informed when the other people didn't do their job.
So a great opportunity we have to redesign a broken system. A great opportunity we have in front of us to do that. I appreciate that. I want to make sure I capture the last thought you had, which is really around making sure that there's not service disruptions because of the process.
Right. Continuity of care.
Right. Service disruptions and continuity that relate to the timelines of the process.
Yep.
So we want to make sure that plan approval process is sensitive to that.
Really, the ICFMRs, the group homes, if there's not a plan in place on the first of the month, what do?
Serve them anyway.
They shouldn't do that. The system might work better if they hadn't done that.
Okay.
Because right now it says it's not retroactive.
Anybody else? Anything? Okay. So, all right. So today our goal, all of the MCOs, all 9 MCOs participated in all of the meetings that Kenneth has held around care management and the plan approval process. It has been a really robust group. We have spent a lot of time talking around a lot of the same subjects you brought up. Although I appreciate how lots of folks can look at the MCO system as one that doesn't care and is cold and isolated and all that, it's really not true. A lot of the folks really care passionately, really want to see this redesign happen, really want to be able to assure that people get the things that they need. And it's done in a sustainable, predictable way. So we're going to talk about, familiarize you guys with how the resource allocation model works as it relates to plan review process today. We're also going to continue to ask for feedback as we go through this. So this will be probably one of the most interactive sessions you'll have in your stakeholder group. So what are some of our recommendations? We're going to talk about the goals of the waiver and how those interface that are currently in the innovations waiver, and how might some of the changes we're proposing through the plan review process for you to consider look once they're implemented. And we're going to constantly ask for your feedback. I encourage you to ask questions, to stop myself or Barb as we're talking, to make sure that you get what we're saying. We understand it's a lot to digest, and we may have to come back lots of times to talk about the intricate details. This is a little higher level view today than a lot of the intricate details. So some of the goals of the innovations waiver, and I'm not going to read these to you all. I'm just going to try to summarize them. So we look at the goals of the waiver. We have them today in our waiver, but they're, because of the way the system's designed, and I've heard Dave talk about this at lots of the listening sessions, as well as in this room in the meeting I attended before. We just don't have some of the flexibility to achieve these just because of the way it's designed. Good or bad, this is the way it was designed when it was designed, and now we have an opportunity, which really in my career is the first time we really had this opportunity. I've been doing this for about 22 years in North Carolina. So really I think we have that before us. With more flexibility, we would hope to be able to really provide more community alternatives to people and get away from some of the institutional design that is out there. It's a great quality service and not diminishing in any way, but wow, wouldn't it be great to offer more because we managed better and people still got what they needed, which is, I think, part of the intent I've heard articulated. So these are our goals, and this is a really important foundation for us to understand as we go forward. These goals were written into the innovations waiver. They're part of the actual technical document. And they can really be accomplished if we focus on developing a creative, innovative service array. And that's a part of the work that this committee's doing, or this stakeholder group is doing, as well as there's a work group working on those service definitions. Having a good array helps you accomplish these goals. So as you guys are talking about, that's important, because while we may approve a plan and authorize services, having a robust array is going to be really important in helping people achieve those life goals. And maybe it's more than what we have right now on the books. There's lots of things out there that we don't have in North Carolina today that might be good additions to consider. And hopefully the service definition group is going to be bringing a lot of those to your group for review. So these goals improve the consumer experience with services. They improve health and social integration. If we're accomplishing them, those things will happen. Ultimately, they give us a degree of fiscal responsibility that can ensure that those public funds support people when they need it, where they need it, how they need it. And that's really the goal. It sounds a little managed care-like, but the whole who and where kind of thing. But it also gives us the options in this resource allocation model and the goals of the innovations waiver to really afford those changes when they happen in people's lives naturally. One of the important things that Bob kind of spoke to, and this is in our design today, part of the reason we included this is to really show it's there now, we're not designed to do it. And so just some very simple things changing really can move us to accomplishing this great stuff. This is all great stuff, and I don't think anybody in this room would disagree with the goals and aspirations in our current innovations waiver. They're really very thoughtful and intentional kinds of things. But the system design is the part that doesn't really work, and that's all the stuff that you all said that you don't like or needs to change. So we're gonna talk a little bit more about this, but it does really help us make sure we are getting what we pay for, and that consumers and families, when they use those budgets, get what they wanted out of that. It makes the process a whole lot simpler. So our group our group gets that this might be an opportunity of a lifetime. MCOs get that we haven't had this kind of flexibility ever in this system in North Carolina, that any of the people in the group can agree ever existed. To have this kind of flexibility in the innovations waiver, home and community-based waiver that supports people. So I just want to make sure, because I know all of you represent lots of different parts of the state of North Carolina, and every MCO has been a very active participant in this particular group and had a lot of involvement in that. So please know that your folks have been at the table and been vocal and asked questions and really strive to understand this change as it have an opportunity to create it and as it unfolds. So with that, I'd like to turn this over to Barb. And Barb is going to talk about sort of the changes. You go to the next slide. That we're recommending. So, Barb. Thank you. Yep.
So, our first title, what are the recommendations for change? These are recommendations, nothing is set in stone yet. We want to get your feedback as Cindy's been doing throughout the presentation. Certain things would stay the same though. So, first of all, we know individuals must be eligible for Medicaid, qualify for Medicaid. They're not negotiable. Individuals meeting the ICF IID level of care. That's something when you're on innovations, we confirm yearly. And there are situations where that does change. It can change for better or for worse. You can have individuals that, unfortunately, from a medical standpoint, they might be regressing. They might need skilled level, nursing care, and that would not meet ICF IID level of care anymore. We also have individuals that might not have functional deficits anymore. They may still have a diagnosis, for example, autism, but may have made enough progress. So it's important to note that we still need to confirm that, and we would need to confirm that yearly, and that's currently the process in place. So the next slide also, as far as what stays the same, care coordination. I think one of the things that I heard with the brainstorming part is the need for maybe a more robust planning process. Now, this is talking about plan approval, but the planning process with the resource allocation model is really critical. We need to meet people's needs, and unfortunately, from the IED standpoint, we've looked at that quote-unquote fix-it model. This is broken, we need to fix it. And there are definitely skills we can work on. We can teach new skills, enhance skills, but if we're not looking at the person holistically, and as Mike said, the 4 and the 2, something gets really lost. So for example, if an individual needs to work on their self-care skills, they're bathing, they're brushing their teeth, they're doing that in isolation, but then we find out the individual wants a girlfriend or a boyfriend. Well, that gives a different motivation. And a lot of times we miss that because currently our system is still focused on the number of skills equals progress equals independence, and that's not always realistic for this population. Anybody, and actually even for us as adults, can't really tell you that there's a lot of skills I've learned this last year, but there might be some real great personal things. I went on a trip. I gained a new friend, significant other. These are the things that are just as important, and for this population that we've kind of ignored. We talk about it with person-centered, but we don't have it integrated yet, and that's kind of the next step where we need to go. So the types of supports, whether they're the natural unpaid supports or the supports from the waiver, are woven together into a plan. And again, that needs to be that more robust planning process. So we're not talking about that in this part of the presentation, but that is something, again, we are all very aware of, and that's really important for a resource allocation model. Thank you. So what will be changing with this model, or what are the recommendations for change? The implementation of a model and a plan approval process that is sustainable and predictable, because that is important, but that also recognizes that people are individuals and their needs are going to change. And they do. They can change for better, for worse, short-term needs, long-term needs. And we're going to talk more about those and examples. So there is, with the resource allocation model, there's a number of different clinical descriptions that are outlined. These descriptions create they're basic descriptions. And what we want to do, though, is we want to make sure that we also have situations outlined or additional descriptions outlined for these short-term or long-term needs that might arise. And that can arise any time in the plan year. A short-term need, which is a temporary need, or a long-term need, doesn't necessarily happen with your annual plan. It can happen at any time. Does anybody have any questions? I don't want to go too fast without.
Right, so one thing I want to point out is, so when we were doing the brainstorming, we talked about that whole eligibility thing. So that's something that CMS would have to change. Because that's not something that we can change at a policy level in North Carolina. That people don't have to be eligible. That they don't have to meet the ICF, IPD, or IID criteria. They just have to. And there has to be a process outlined for that, at least at this time. And maybe there's some advocacy that could happen at a more federal level. That would change it. It's not, they don't have to do that.
That's not maybe one of the things, yeah, that's.
So we don't have to do it annually.
Oh, no,
to change it.
The level of care is a federal requirement.
Right, the level of care is a federal requirement, and the requirement that we evaluate that annually is a federal requirement. So we can't change that, that's my point.
But it's how you evaluate.
Right. How you evaluate it is what we have some flexibility.
Right, there you go.
Right?
Because
But we haven't done, I don't know what group's working on that, but that's not a part of the plan approval process.
Because Barbara, in your you started out by saying, well, in these some of these situations in autism or higher functioning autism, we'd have to, and so the sort of evaluating need is different than evaluating a diagnosis.
Right. Yes, exactly.
And that is really, and I guess one of my concerns is the amount of time being spent on reestablishing diagnoses.
Right. Because aren't we now using our state's definition of IDD, correct? Which includes deficits within areas of socialization, communication, behavior, blah, 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 not diagnosis. Right.
Yeah, we use it, it's not a state definition, it's a federal definition.
But yet and this is some of my lack of knowledge about how the system totally works currently. So, but yet people are always coming in with more and more requests for diagnostic updates.
Correct.
Or recombinant.
Right, and some of that could today be around how the way the policies are written or interpreted around, and this gets back to some of that consistency. Some places require every 3 years, no matter what, on hell or high water, you must have a psychological evaluation.
Right.
So I think to your point, Cindy, I think what might make sense is maybe this is something that could incorporate into this group, actually, because it kind of fits into it maybe better than some of the others, and we can go back and take a look at that and talk about exactly what it is the feds are looking for where we do have that flexibility. I think that's a great idea.
And a couple of comments.
Sure.
First, I want to make a comment based on what just been commented about, just because it's fresh in everybody's mind. First of all, I want to say I totally get that there's federal regulations that the state cannot change. Totally get that. No argument for me. And I would hope, and I will probably end up being involved at some point or another, whether it's calling legislature, whatever, that there will be advocacy for changes to federal law. Having said that, though, I feel as though even if the state can't strictly do anything about it, even making people aware at the federal level that this is something that our state is talking about, I don't know if that's within the purview of you guys, but it probably should be. And that's something that I would just kind of give a friendly encouragement to of, I know you can't strictly do anything about it, but you can at least, in making our suggestions, we could at least say, this is something that we hope to see change at the federal level. And that'll probably help the process, at least a little bit. The other comment that I wanted to make, though, about was in regards to what you said about personal goals and how those can mean just as much, if not more, than some of the other types of goals that we talked about. I can speak from personal experience as to how profound something like that can be. And not only is it better for the person, and not only does it improve their quality of life, but it also potentially fosters future natural sports. And so we should really be encouraging that. It's not going to be a replacement for other things, but I feel like it gets ignored sometimes as something, oh, well, that would be nice, but I just don't think it's going to happen. And it's like, first of all, that's not a healthy way to look at it, but second of all, you're kind of cheating yourself out of something there too, because the system would be helped if people with disabilities had more effective social and personal relationships, whatever those may manifest.
I'm so glad you added that, because that was exactly what I was trying to explain. You did a much better job explaining that. But that's exactly the point, that it's not our quote-unquote number of skills and moving through prompt levels, but what are we achieving and mixing that together. And are we really being person-centered? If that person has a dream, are we really making sure that we're providing the support to achieve that dream? I don't care if it's realistic or not, but how are we exploring it?
And I just have to add, just for the sake of a friend of mine who happens to have Down syndrome, two friends of mine actually, they are trying to have a relationship right now, and it's like pulling teeth with the current service system, and I see it happening every day, and it's kind of twisted, to be honest. So, it is very real, and it really does happen. So I don't want to, and I don't think anybody does think that, but just in case they do, I don't want anybody to think that that's just something that people are, making up, or that it doesn't really happen, because it does, and the system does. Not only does it not help, but it actively dissuades in certain cases.
I think you're absolutely right, especially when we look at progress and outcomes, when we're not looking at it holistically and about the long-term needs of the individuals with intellectual and developmental disabilities.
So I just have to say this, in our conversations the past 2 days around making this presentation together for you guys, that exact example was one that Barb kept throwing up about how people have these relationships, and when you're looking at plans and they want to have a girlfriend or a boyfriend, and how the system really prevents them from doing exactly that. And so making sure that we were all aware, that it really does in terms of design and services and the way they get delivered and who's doing all that stuff. Really, it can be a hindrance, exactly the point you're making. So she kept saying it over and over. So it's really kind of neat to hear that we're on this same page. Really neat. It's really neat to know that.
You have just improved Barb's credibility.
And validated her a lot. You just don't know how much you validated her.
You're welcome. You're welcome. Anytime.
Been out there a few times, and I'll tell you, as Cindy knows, I've said it in the work group, and Kenneth knows, nothing breaks my heart more than reading a plan about all these goals and seeing the dreams of, I want a boyfriend, I want a girlfriend, but I can't meet anybody in the state program. I want a job, and nobody's interested, and they're not looking at the things I'm interested in. There's no activities surrounding the dreams. So I'm very, very passionate about that. So thank you. What I want to also emphasize, in 1 second, is that a resource allocation model is not a cookie cutter approach at all. So, and we'll talk more about that with the different options when there's long-term, short-term needs and people that just kind of don't fit in. There's lots of examples of that. But yeah, did you have a question?
I just wanted to reinforce a couple of things. My family member that receives services does try to have a social life, and I would say that the service system typically is not flexible enough to allow, social requires flexibility. A friend can come over this afternoon, but you had things scheduled.
Yeah.
I'm supposed to receive services today. So therefore, top priority of development of social relationships and networks is actually impeded by the service system rather than promoted. And I want to reinforce the thing on the federal requirements. In the current environment of reducing the burden of our service system upon the provider and the people that receive services, we should always consider the federal requirements as being the most restrictive. And if the state ever considers making a more burdensome, restrictive, higher level of requirement for anything other than the federal requirement, it needs to go up a red flag, and we need to call it out and say, does this need to be more restrictive or required?
On behalf of
We
the
need a more
state,
flexible
I
system.
completely agree.
I'm sorry, Kathy?
On behalf of the state, I think I can say that we agree with you.
Excellent.
We do, and I think Cindy will take that back because that's obviously something she's
I did,
passionate about. I
because
think
we got
that'd be a good group to come up with something, so.
We will.
We'll take a look at what we can and cannot do, and yes, sir. In fact, that's why we're having these meetings, why we're going in that, I mean, that's
I
the
wanted
whole
to-
point of this whole conversation.
What I said, I
is
wanted
that.
to affirm that. That's good. That's
I
good.
don't, what do I owe you? If I get a bill?
You really don't want to ask that question.
Know some good stuff.
Just start with your tiara.
Nobody gets my tiara.
We have another question.
I have one comment to make about that, the definition and the level of care for IID. The federal government has their definition, and a state is free to write its own definition. And last year, when we had meetings about the DOJ settlement, there was a fabulous presentation about how different states have different definitions. And those states who have a very loose definition of institutional level of care are getting federal match money because people now qualify for the waiver. So it's not state-funded services that are going towards those people who don't meet the very tough, strict federal definition of institutional care. It was a fabulous presentation because there are states with a population equal to ours, but on their 1915 CIDD waiver, they have 60,000 individuals receiving services. And it's all because their definition is incredibly loose. Just saying.
Isn't that the law get behind a waiver?
Yeah.
Waive the federal standard?
But there's also finite numbers. We also have finite numbers, so I think our barrier is more along the finite numbers because we have individuals functioning at all different levels. I don't know if you want to add to that, Kathy, too, about, there's, we don't have 60,000.
It's a finite number of dollars, so if you have those 60,000 people, okay, but what do they get and how are we going to fund it? So something just to keep in mind as we think that process through. Andrew is even agreeing with me, so I must have said something right there. So, well, I mean, I think that, I hear your point. It's a balancing act.
And the idea of the different clinical descriptions, some people will need less intensive services, some more moderate, some higher intensive. So understanding that that's not cookie cutter, but that could, could that open up more funding? Maybe it could. Maybe, I mean, if we can kind of, spread that out more. So with the clinical descriptions, there's always going to be outliers or individuals that don't match. On a national level, this occurs. This is not just North Carolina, this is a resource allocation model. So the first situation I want to talk about would be temporary needs. Temporary needs can be clinical needs or they can be non-clinical needs. So for example, if an individual's caregiver falls and breaks his hip or her hip, God forbid, and this, planning team's already met, we're in the middle of the annual plan, the individual and the planning team can request a temporary increase for additional respite, for example, for the caregiver, because the caregiver is recuperating. Additional supervision for the individual, because the caregiver, when they had natural supports, that's much more limited now. Maybe it's single parent situation. Temporary is a need that's expected to be resolved within 6 months. That's a short-term need. Nobody planned for it. It happened. but chances are we're going to need additional services, supports, to get through. Unless you have a large family, maybe not, but for some people, there's one person taking care of that individual. From a clinical standpoint, you might have, for example, an individual that just started having seizures. They've never had seizures, so they're in the process of working with the doc to look at meds, seeing if they can get the seizures under control, but maybe they've fallen a few times. They've had serious consequences of the seizures, so they need more supervision during this exploration time. So this would allow, this temporary situation allows additional services to be accessed while we're exploring this need. Sometimes the need goes into a long-term need. For example, if the seizure situation could not be resolved, and unfortunately the individual is not responding to medication, as everybody had hoped, that may then move into a long-term need. So the importance of the flexibility and knowing that people's needs will change, again, whether it's clinical or not, I think it's really important to look at this holistically. The permanent situations, permanent changes. So these are situations that are not expected to be resolved within 6 months. So a clinical example is you have an individual that was, say pretty high functioning, was pretty self-sufficient, and now is diagnosed with dementia, is beginning to forget how to do things, is needing a lot more reminders. We know that this situation is not going to get better, unfortunately. As the dementia progresses, the individual is going to need more care. They're not going to need less care. This is a significant change for the individual. This is a permanent change. So this is something that needs to be monitored because they're going to need additional support, throughout the diagnosis, throughout this process. So that's an example of a permanent change.
Will that include the elderly, like just maintaining needs?
That, yeah, it could include, or it could be like an elderly caregiver situation. So if you had, an elderly caregiver, it might go into temporary first because we want to see, are we, is there somebody else that's set up to assist the individual, or do we need to wrap around some services while we're doing some planning? But that's what allows for that flexibility. So it's for the individual as well as for their natural supports. Like the temporary situation with the caregiver breaking her hip or his hip. It's not the individual that broke his hip, it's the caregiver. But that creates a situation where that individual needs more support. Does that make sense?
Yeah, the example I have is I have several people that are in their late 60s or 70s that we serve, and versus trying to teach them new things and focus on and keeping the skill level that they have. Sometimes that requires more support.
Right, exactly. And the situations, and that's something else we haven't done a great job. We nationally, aging in the IDD population, the services, the supports, how they're going to be involved in, their end-of-life planning, all of these, tough, it's tough to talk about the relationship stuff and the work stuff, but this is just as tough. It's just on a different level. So does anybody have any questions about the temporary or permanent? Did that address the situation?
Yeah. No question, just a very brief comment. It's not 100% connected, but it's very close. I assume when we say caregiver, it's actually referred to that. That I totally get it and I agree with it. Another problem though is that even with paid supports, and this more has to do with building a provider network, which I realize is a little bit off in the distance from what we're talking about. I want to make sure I brought it up because I experienced it recently where a paid support that I had was going through some medical issues, and so I needed to, get another person for the duration of his care. Well, it was extremely difficult to find anybody that, that was willing and able to do it. And thankfully we did, and thankfully it wasn't a terribly long-term situation, and the natural supports could fill in. But that's another thing that really needs to be bolstered is provider networks and specific backup staffing, because it's not good.
It's not good right now, and that is an excellent point, because if any of us relied on one person to meet specific needs, we would be in trouble because something could happen to that person, good or bad. They could win the lottery, they could fall and break their leg, they can get sick, their back can go out. So that's it's an awesome point, and it's something, when somebody's really good and we click, of course we love having them around. I mean, if I have some coworkers, if they left, I'd be devastated, but we need to be able to have our backups. That's important. Thank you. Does anybody else have anything? Yeah.
So this last paragraph here is really a critical paragraph.
It is. And you can take it from here. Go ahead.
Well, and maybe your coming slides explains it, but as a service system, what I was at a statewide meeting yesterday, and it was articulated the fear, and it's fear that the system, the person's acuity will be higher than the assigned clinical description. The assigned clinical description being determined, I guess, within this system by the utilization management system, right? Who does the assigned clinical description?
So we'll talk about that a little bit later in the presentation, and actually that's kind of probably a whole nother, but I'll hit on that, so if you just hold that for a second. But I do want to emphasize, as you said, this last paragraph is really critical, that if an individual does have needs that cannot be met within that category description, those services will be authorized, that this system allows for that. Now again, this is needs, it's not wants, it's needs. So I do have, that's important to emphasize that there is a difference, but that individual whose caregiver fell and broke her hip, that person needs more. That caregiver needs more respite. That individual is going to need, probably need more support. So.
And they're going to need it like right away. They're not going to need it 2 weeks or a month from now. And so something built into the system that looks at that piece for those crisis situations, those emergency situations that really need something quickly to set it on.
So, and having gotten, so I don't know if you want to add, so we've got an expedited review process, but that might be something too with care coordination. Is there a way to do things a little faster? Could something be done in a different manner that, mom fell and this happened, or somebody, again, I hate to always get scared of saying somebody, got into a car accident and something's needed immediately, but making sure that we're not being, bureaucratic about it.
Yeah, we do, all MCOs have processes required by the accreditation bodies that we're under to do expedited reviews. 72 hours is the time frame, I think, on URAC accredited entities. So 3 days might be too long, though, right? Especially if they broke their hip today and tonight you need total care kind of needs met. It can't be tomorrow. So that's when you may have to do some kind of retroactive authorization or process. And I think knowing that flexibility exists and that everybody, doing the right thing is the most important thing to meet the needs of the person, and fixing that on the back end may sometimes have to be the way that it's addressed. In our current system, folks are kind of worried sometimes about jumping out there and doing that care and hoping they'll get an authorization for it after the fact, right? Because that's not the way that things have really been designed up until this point. So I think we've been very sensitive to that. It's not like we don't want to do that. It's just, who's going to pay the audit risk on that when you don't do it in accordance to the policy.
Is it better to do it that way or to have some sort of unmanaged cost on the MH side of things? Yeah. Depends on the kind of crisis.
I think what I would say is that it doesn't matter with everything else, that you've got to do this.
Do the right thing.
Because I will tell you one thing that we heard in a lot of different ways, and I want to listen to it. This is a huge fear, and apparently no one's doing it well. So, I think we've got to figure out something better.
So, yeah, and whether that's a verbal authorization, whatever it is, but making sure we can, some things happen.
Do it right and now.
Right.
And then figure out how to fix that on the back end.
Right. If I have a heart attack in the next second.
Yeah, we have to figure out what we're doing with Katie tonight.
Sounds like this.
So don't get worked up, Mary. Okay?
Well, no, but if you keep trying to shush me, I might. Sorry.
Bridge funding concept into that part of the system that says, okay, authorizations have ceased to exist because of timing and whatever, but we have an emergency You just need enough time to be able to do some triage and take care of the emergency so we can stabilize the situation. Because if we don't, the potential cost goes way up if we're dealing now with a crisis that is ongoing.
So something that we can take back to our group and everything is that concept of the bridge.
So pass through
A verbal
on a crisis
right,
service.
verbal.
Pass
Verbal
through.
authorization.
A little retroactive.
Well, the return on investment for a short-term fix is a whole lot better than the long-term cost of not having it.
Exactly.
I've got a question that relates to that, like the system, are there system level barriers that prevent, once those, even if there wasn't within 72 hours an authorization made, and then I've had families where they get the authorization and then they can't get it stacked.
That's right.
So that's way too in the weeds for me. I don't know but are there barriers where that are?
Now having standby staff and how the people on the retainer, they may or may not get called. It really is the backup. How do you fund that? It's not really needed. Nice to have.
Now, is that out of the scope of the waiver, that?
Mm-mm. Nope.
Could be in there. Those are some really great things to try to figure out how to do. I mean, in the mental health side, there are some services with pass-through for authorization. That's a nice thing to maybe, nice thing that we could copy conceptually, not the medical model rehab or any of that, just the concept of pass-through on certain definitions to address this kind of crisis issue. The thing that people get worried about on the MCO side is how do you control costs with that, and people abusing it, and sort of some of those things, is figuring out how to make that happen. But we will definitely talk about it. I wrote it down, Kenneth, so it'll be on our group's task list from today.
We'll take it back.
Next. So the takeaway for this slide is that individuals, and a couple of you mentioned this transparency, individuals will be told what their clinical description is, and they'll also be told the services that they can access. So we're going to talk more about the descriptions, the clinical descriptions in later slides, but they will be informed, and if they have needs that, and again, this would be at the planning table, if they are an outlier, they have needs that won't be able to be addressed, they can work with their care coordinator if it's, whether it's permanent, something's going on right then and there, or if it's temporary. So the next section is actually the plan approval process. What's not changing, we can go through this quickly, is that we still need to authorize services. If a request is denied, then applicable appeal rights will be given. So someone had mentioned appeal rights earlier. There you go. So yes, appeal rights are given. Good.
That's not really true, but we can just go on.
Can we just say they should be given, and we need to work on making sure that process standardized as well?
Thank you.
Okay, so there are three components for the plan review process with the resource allocation model. We still need health and safety, waiver compliance, and support needs. And support needs is going to be a little different than what most people have been used to. So quickly, health and safety.
Whoa, why did...
This is just the part of the, did you have a...
No, I'm sorry. He just scrolled through about 4 pages at once.
I'm trying to move it faster.
We're going to post this.
I know.
So the health and safety component is really just making sure that the assessments and the information within the plan, that any risks that are identified are being addressed. So if there's a risk that's been identified, it's important that it's addressed. That's really the bare bones of it. Waiver compliance. We just need to make sure that the plan that's submitted complies with services and policies that are contained in the innovations waiver. The innovations waiver is the context. Just like we might not want to drive 55 miles an hour, but that's a speed limit, we need to drive 55 miles an hour. So what we need to make sure we're tying to is the innovations waiver when someone's submitting a plan. I don't always drive the speed limit, but it's always something people can relate to. The support needs part of it. So this is where, when the plan is submitted, we want to make sure it's this double check that the individual's overall clinical description, clinical presentation match their description. So if it looks like, even if the planning team didn't identify a temporary need or a long-term need, and the plan review process it's important that if something jumps out at us, that we go back to the planning team and let them know. And that, and that can occur. So we want to make sure people don't, sometimes people might think that they're stuck within that category description, and it's important to understand they're not, that if your needs can be met, and most people can, and that's true within their category description, but there are going to be times where they can't, whether it's long-term or short-term, and I can't emphasize that enough. So making sure everybody understands that it's not a cookie-cutter approach, and that we're respecting that people are not static, that their needs are going to change.
It's just a question about plans and the way you guys are thinking about it right now. So one of the things that we've heard a lot from people is that what we do right now really isn't very person-centered.
Right.
What we do is really much more of a treatment plan process versus person-centered. Is there any way to separate those two?
I think the retrospective review part is going to answer that, which is a couple slides down.
The what?
It doesn't sound like it's what I'm saying, but go ahead.
Okay. We'll see. Yeah, we'll see if it does. So retrospective review part. So when we talked about front end and back end for planning, we talked about for the plan review. The front end are those three pieces that we just talked about: the health and safety, our waiver compliance, and the support needs. What's interesting with the resource allocation model is that we also have a back-end review process, and we want that to be a bit more intensive. This is the retrospective review that looks back at all different levels. It can look back at the individual level to see if the individuals, what their outcomes were. Was it aligned with what they had indicated in their plan? And we might look at a provider, an overall provider, to see if there are services that they're delivering. We can look at a number of different individuals that they're, providing services for. We might look at an actual clinical description. So if we had a clinical description that we were concerned, for example, that individuals were underutilizing services, we might want to go back and look at that description for people who are in that description to see, does that match? Is there not enough of something, too much of, something else? And then the overall model. And the overall model, before implementing a resource allocation model, there's clinical data as well as utilization data, and that's what informs the clinical descriptions. When the clinical descriptions are designed and the service arrays are designed, what happens is there's a chart review, a pull to look to make sure that this makes sense, that it's going to be clinically appropriate, but also flexible enough. So if I have minimal needs and Deb has minimal needs, but I want to volunteer. Maybe I'm in my late 70s and I don't really want to get a job. I want to do some volunteer work. I want a companion. Deb's 25 and she wants to get a job. We both have minimal needs. We both are pretty high functioning, but we have very different goals. We want to make sure those services are going to be flexible enough to address both of that. The other part, and I think too, Dave, with what you're saying is the whole progress part and documentation, that if that individual, what is the outcome for that individual? What does that individual really want, and how is that tying together? And right now, there's a huge mismatch with that. So that's something, we've talked about that, and Cindy and kind of can tell you in our work group, as what, as documentation and how that looks. And we're kind of almost dealing with I don't want to, I guess for lack of a better word, an antiquated system with a minute by minute trying to figure out what we did instead of looking at is that a good word? Okay. Without looking at overall, it's kind of hard to, if somebody was wanting to get a job and they were exploring different things that they could volunteer to see if they're interested. And that time was spent doing some research, staff did research. How do we account for that, and how do we show progress? If that narrowed down to 5 things I like and 10 things I don't like, that's huge progress. But our system doesn't necessarily allow that to show progress. So, and that's kind of along with what needs to happen. The service definition work group is working on that, progress. But the retrospective reviews allow for more of that, for, looking at those outcomes, rather than just a progress lens, a medical model lens.
So two thoughts, just thinking out loud, and one of them, suppose Matthew wanted to write his person's name, and he really didn't care whether the care coordination showed up or not. He wanted, people in his life here, and he had somebody to facilitate. Could he do that in this new system?
So care coordination still scribes the plan, so we can't, unless we, Well, unless we want to make those changes, unless we want to make those
I mean,
changes.
can't care
right?
coordination do just the ISP?
Sure, and he does as
somebody-
well, yeah.
And somebody else do their own person's info.
Oh, sure,
But I don't think they're the
absolutely.
same thing. I don't think they align hardly. I think they tend to be, ISPs tend to be authorization plans, right? Versus personal kind of plans.
I really like the sound of that.
And I guess I'm asking the question, because I think that's one of the things that we heard a lot from people is that they didn't feel like anything we did was really person-centered. What they thought we did was very simple. And so the idea of the retrospective review sounds great, but I'll tell you one of the things that I suspect that some of our other folks might say, something about jumping down this stuff. Sam, one thing that you be real cautious that the retrospective review doesn't become something that says, gee, we don't like the way you use the services, so we're going to cut them. Because I think that's just the sound of that.
We don't want to punitive.
That's what it sounds like.
And we worked on it not being, right? We worked on it not being.
No, I understand. I guess what I'd say is, I don't think the idea of calling it retrospective view in anything we put in literature is a good idea. I think you probably want to call it something else.
We talked about, how much have we talked about wordsmithing and how important it is because, going back, like, for example, when we looked at a certain group of people, we actually found the opposite, Dave. We found this high-level functioning group was not getting enough individual support employment. And we need to beef that up for them because that's why their plans are saying, I don't get to do this.
No, I wouldn't argue against that. I'm just arguing the sound.
Yeah.
That's all.
If I can, real quickly on the stakeholder engagement group, when we got done, if you get done looking at all the things they said they wanted, what they really, if you had to break it down into one paragraph, Dave just said that paragraph. They want the control over being able to say, I'm going to do my plan. You can figure out how to organize the damn services. How you do that part is less important to me than that you're working on what I want to work on.
And that's a robust planning process that we know that these are John's goals. And it doesn't, just like when I go to the doctor, I don't necessarily know the exact procedures. That doctor needs to know. I know what's wrong with me. But, that's your job. You fix it. But these are my goals, so we want somebody skilled enough that can say, hey, how about this, and this is how this can work. And that's different.
Separate and apart. That's really, I think, the question. And just to add one thing, somebody that sends something we talk about from the doctor, who said, doctor comes in asking me a bunch of questions. I don't really give a damn what he likes to answer. Frankly, that doesn't care to me. How does he pay for it? I don't care. As long as what I get is well.
I care if the retrospective review from Blue Cross Blue Shield says, no, it isn't covered.
Right, yeah, that's the other
But if you already have
that really pisses me off.
Follow up with what Dave said, there are two very real dangers if you go that route. One of which is, no matter how well intended it is at this level, you say, our intent is to be very concerned about the individual. My experience has always been you build for the lowest common denominator. There's going to be somebody down the line who's going to look at this and say, okay, this is a retrospective review and I'm going to use this to determine what happens next. And that's one danger. The other is the other side of this, that where that doesn't happen, but the perception from the person receiving the services is that it is happening. And either one causes just as much damage to the system, because if I perceive that this is a problem, my common phrase is, perception's reality. If I perceive it, then I'm going to behave as if it is. And that's part of the problem we run into right now. Even though there are good services being provided in a number of places, perception is that it isn't, and it's not it's an all or nothing system. If it's happening a little bit, it's happening everywhere.
Right, and these, again, we said, these were our general thoughts on the whole system to present to you to see what you feel about it, so we can definitely take those back and kind of relook at language and all that kind of stuff, and try to be more clear.
Well, not just language, but at purpose.
That's conceptually
That's the concept of it.
Right.
So let me just make sure, Dave, what you were suggesting is separating the plan that is, could we, I'm trying to make sure I get the concept right. Could we separate the person-centered plan part of it from whatever the mechanism is that gets the funding approved?
And
I think that's simple.
Yeah, it is that simple. And this is, I don't know, it happened with case management, I think it happens with care coordination, I think it's going to happen in every system, is that the idea of trying to do more connectiveness and community-based stuff tends to get lost when the system is about, when the process is about how you fund something. the process is about my life, and that's what I care about, and I say this a lot, and I do mean it, but I don't want to do it, is that in fact the best person that I've ever seen, I've written on back of napkins. It has nothing to do with the format that we do, none of anything else. It's about what do you really want. The best that we can do, I mean, think about the super care coordinator would be that person that can take what's written on the back of a napkin, put it into an ability to get us funded, and the things that don't have to be funded, they don't do. I mean, that to me sounds like that. I don't know if we can get there, but that would be good.
Well, and that's that robust planning process, that person's skilled enough to be able to take that, and they can also think outside the box, not worrying about tying shoes or, brushing teeth and, moving outside of that. Is there, so, I'm done. Bye.
I'm trying to rush it.
Well, no, I mean, it's fine, we're discussion, but maybe we can take a 10-minute break before.
But we actually have one thing I wanted to do to tie up before you jump up and get a soda, is just to kind of maybe take a little survey. So when we went through all the stuff that, we've still got a lot of work to do, we're not there yet, obviously, but did we address a lot of the stuff that you talked about in the brainstorming at the beginning? I mean, do you think that we're on the right track in our group to try to not have it be so barriers to accessing services and starting to get the idea of an individual budget? Did you feel like that the plan approval process moved any in a more positive direction than it is today from what Barb has presented, we talked about? Do you feel like we hit some of those things that are up on the wall? We're going to take them all back. Justin actually put some check marks up in purple for the things that you said that we feel like we did address. At least, in moving away from a medical model and really making it more about what the person, the to and the for, to put it in the words you used today. We really do feel like we're getting away from all of that nitpicking about how many hours do people get, because, if they're within that budget, that's what they're going to get. And if they're not in that budget, then we're going to look at these temporary needs and permanent needs and long-term needs, and how does that play into what their budgets are looking like, or accounts, or whatever we end up calling those, because there are probably better words to use in that particular language pattern too. So just if you get a chance, look at that and see if there's something that you feel like we should really hone in on, let us know, because we definitely want to make sure we get with the stakeholder engagement.
And just one other piece, the circles, just because you're probably not, that's things that we still have to address. So I heard people talking about, some of the step requirements. So those are things that I think we can continue to look at. We also want to look at some of the retro language. I did hear some consistency with paperwork. I think we still have to do some more work on that. And then just the documentation issues, and I think Dave kind of touched on that as well. So the circles are what we still need to work on.
Matt, can you hear our last comment, and then
Sure thing.
people can make some more comments?
And it's a wrap up comment. So not only do I feel like you guys made some steps to address some of what we were talking about, but based on the presentations, I mean, I'm only speaking for myself here, but I feel like the people that are here that are listening and are giving this presentation, not only have you made some steps, but I feel confident that that this group is really going to work towards some of the things that still need to be worked on. So I feel good from that perspective as well.
Can I add one more thing?
No.
Please. I want to know what Matthew had the last word. One word I want to say, I've been coming to a lot of meetings around this stuff, and obviously on a different side of that, but I think this is the first time I've seen a presentation from folks about what sort of the under the hood aspects of what's going on. And I think often that's one of those frustrations that families and people with disabilities have, is that, it's sort of this, yeah, I understand what happens there, but what the hell happens then? It goes off somewhere else and it gets disputed. So I really appreciate the honesty and the upfront way that you guys have presented this, because I think sometimes it's not so easy to put out front that that is. So thank you so much for that.
So we'll come back at 3 o'clock on the dot, and I'm sure there might be some more discussions about this, because I don't know if this is the last definition will take that long, so